It was supposed to be the breakthrough of the century. We'd spent years on the project, carefully refining theories, perfecting the technology, running countless tests. We were scientists, engineers, explorers. But when you dig deep enough, sometimes you strike something you're not meant to find. And when we opened that portal, we didn't just open a window. We opened a door. It was an ordinary enough day at the lab. No grandiose speeches, no dramatic countdown, just the hum of machines and the anxious murmurs of a team gathered around. The portal stabilized in a shimmer of light, a hazy frame hanging in the air. It was silent. We stared into it, feeling a strange pull, as if it wasn't just light coming through. It was more, something you couldn't name. A sensation that crawled over your skin, settled somewhere deep inside, like it already knew you. When we stepped through, we expected something similar to what we knew. Another Earth. Perhaps subtly different. Maybe the sky would be a different shade or the landscape unfamiliar, but the sky was the same. That's where the similarities ended. It was quiet. Too quiet. Even in the most desolate places on our Earth, there's always a hint of life, a bird's call, the rustling of leaves, wind moving through grass. But here, there was nothing, just a blanket of silence that stretched far beyond sound. The buildings looked the same, but empty. We walked down streets that might have been bustling once, where people laughed, talked, lived. But there were no signs of struggle, no smashed glass, no boarded-up doors, just empty rooms, empty streets, frozen in a way that seemed wrong. Like they hadn't decayed, hadn't faded. They just sat there, abandoned, as if the people had simply vanished. One moment here, the next, nothing. Some of us started to feel it early on, a kind of dread, a wrongness pressing down on us. It was subtle, easy to ignore at first, but it crept into you, like something watching, waiting. No one wanted to say it out loud, but we all felt it. The air was heavy, thick, and it felt like every breath took a bit of you with it. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, someone, was looking at us, even though the streets were deserted. We didn't talk much as we moved deeper into the city. Every now and then someone would mutter something, how they recognized a building, how a street looked familiar. It was as if the place was a twisted reflection of home. The same, yet different, like staring into a mirror that was just slightly out of alignment. As if the place had memory. It remembered things. And as we moved through it, I started to feel like it remembered us. That's when we found the first house. The front door was open, just a crack, as if someone had left it that way, waiting for us. The place looked lived in. A coffee cup sat on the table, a newspaper spread open, chairs slightly pulled back as if people had been there only moments before. It looked as if they'd simply stepped out, intending to return any minute. But it was too still, too quiet. And that silence, it wasn't the kind that brought peace. It was hollow, lingering, like the house itself was waiting for us to break it. One of the team touched the coffee cup almost as if on instinct, and froze. His hand shook as he pulled it back. It was cold, cold like it had been left there for days, no, longer. It was the kind of chill that seeps deep, like it's part of the place now. The rooms were just as unsettling, untouched and timeless, like snapshots of lives paused. Pictures on walls, clothes neatly folded, beds made, everything in its place, waiting for people who would never return. And then we heard it, faint at first, a low hum coming from somewhere deep in the house. It was mechanical, but broken, uneven, like it was struggling to keep going. The noise was faint, almost hidden under that weighty silence, but unmistakable. It drew us in, tugging at some primal part of us that should have known better than to follow. We moved toward it, step by step, feeling that strange pull again. Like the house itself wanted us to come closer. When we reached the basement door, we hesitated. Something was down there. We could all feel it. Something not quite right. That hum, now louder, pulsed through the air, each beat of sound like a heartbeat, as if the house itself was alive. And as we looked at each other, one by one, we saw the same fear reflected in each other's eyes. Whatever was down there wasn't meant to be seen. We lingered there, caught in a standoff with our own curiosity. The air grew colder, and I felt that familiar weight settling in again, heavier now, thicker. It wasn't just fear. It was something else, something darker, like the place knew what we were thinking, knew what we'd found, and it didn't want us to leave. That's when we heard the click, a faint, soft click from somewhere behind us, like a door closing gently, as if someone had just stepped into the room. But there was no one there. We froze, caught in that unnatural quiet, listening as the click echoed softly in the silence. My heart pounded as I glanced back, half expecting to see someone standing there watching us. But there was nothing, just the empty hall stretching back to the front door. Everything was still in place, frozen, but it felt different now, like the house had taken a breath, aware of us in a way that felt almost predatory. One of us whispered, barely loud enough to hear, "Did you hear that?" No one answered. We just looked at each other, that quiet terror settling between us. No one wanted to go back to the hall, but the basement door loomed in front of us, and that faint hum still pulsed from below. It was impossible to tell where the sound was coming from exactly. It felt like it was all around us, as if the house was hiding something right under our feet. We pushed open the basement door slowly, and it creaked, breaking the silence with a long, drawn-out groan that felt almost mocking. The stairs led down into darkness, and as the faint glow from our flashlights swept over the steps, they seemed to sink deeper and deeper, as if the basement had no end. The air down there was colder, sharper, like stepping into a place that had never seen light. I felt my throat tighten as I took the first step, feeling that strange pull intensify, urging me down deeper. As we descended, the hum grew louder, turning into a low, rhythmic pulse. I could feel it vibrating through the walls, through my bones, in sync with each step. The basement stretched out before us, larger than it should have been, lined with shelves and scattered with objects that seemed familiar. A broken doll, an old leather book, a cracked mirror. It was like someone had gathered remnants from lives, fragments of memories that didn't belong together, that didn't belong to this place. They were just here, as if they'd been left for us to find. We moved slowly, each of us gripping our flashlights, eyes darting over the shelves and corners. Shadows clung to the edges, thick and unmoving, and every so often the beam of light would catch something just out of sight, a hint of movement, a flicker. But whenever we turned, there was nothing. It was as if the darkness was alive, shifting around us, hiding things in plain sight, and yet it was that hum that kept us moving, pulling us deeper, as if there was something we had to see, something that we couldn't ignore. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the hum stopped. The silence fell again, heavier now, pressing down on us with a weight that was almost physical. We stood there, breathing shallowly, afraid to move, and in that silence we began to notice other things. The faint, almost inaudible sounds. A drip of water somewhere far off. A slight creak as if someone was shifting their weight nearby. But we were the only ones down here. Or so we thought. One of the team, a quiet guy who hadn't said much, let out a sharp breath, his flashlight catching on something that made him stop cold. We turned to look, following his light. At first it seemed like nothing, just another wall stained with age and grime. But then we saw it. There were scratches, deep gouges running along the wall, forming shapes, words even. But they weren't in any language we recognized. They twisted and curled, overlapping each other in ways that made them hard to look at, like they were shifting, changing, refusing to stay still. A chill ran through me, deeper than any fear I'd ever felt. These markings, they were a message, a warning, but not one that was meant for us to understand. I could feel it, the intent behind them. Something dark and ancient, older than anything we'd ever known. This place, it wasn't just empty, it was abandoned, forsaken, left behind by something far more powerful than we could comprehend. And it had left its mark, a reminder for anyone who dared to cross into its domain. One of us tried to trace the marks with a finger, but as soon as he touched them, he pulled back, gasping. He said he felt something piercing, like a needle digging into his skin. The scratches seemed to pulse for a moment, just a brief flicker of movement, as if acknowledging him, acknowledging us. And then, in the stillness, we heard it, a whisper, faint and barely there, like it was coming from the walls themselves, seeping out from the scratches. We couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, warning us or taunting us. I couldn't tell which. We backed away slowly, instinctively moving closer together, our breaths shallow and quick. None of us wanted to be the first to turn around, to face that darkness waiting behind us. But we couldn't stay, not with those whispers growing louder, merging with the silence in a way that felt unnatural, invasive. It was like the house itself was speaking to us, telling us to leave while we still could. But when we turned, we saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the light. At first it was just a shadow, an outline, but as we stared, it began to take shape, slowly, almost reluctantly. It was human, or close enough to pass for one. But there was something wrong. Its form wavered like it was struggling to stay solid, flickering in and out of existence. It didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood there, watching us with eyes that weren't really there, hollow and dark. None of us dared to speak. We just stood there, paralyzed, caught in its gaze. And in that moment, I felt something strange. A sense of recognition, like I'd seen it before, known it somehow. But that wasn't possible. This was another world, another reality, and yet the longer I looked, the more I felt familiar, as if it knew me, knew all of us. And then, in a low, rasping voice, it spoke. Just one word, echoing through the darkness, sinking into us like a cold blade. Leave. We didn't need to be told twice. That single word was enough to snap us out of whatever strange hold the place had on us. We stumbled back, moving faster than I thought possible, barely able to keep our flashlight steady as we scrambled up the stairs. The air felt heavier with every step, like the house itself was pushing back against us, making every movement harder, slower, as if it didn't want us to go. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following, creeping just beyond the reach of our light, waiting for one of us to fall behind. When we reached the top of the stairs, I slammed the basement door shut, the echo reverberating through the empty house. For a moment, we just stood there, catching our breath, trying to process what we'd seen. None of us spoke. The silence that had felt heavy before was now suffocating, pressing down on us from all sides. I glanced around, expecting to see the rest of the team, but something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that our group was smaller than when we'd come in. Then one of us broke the silence, a shaky whisper that barely seemed to hold itself together. "Where's Marcus?" I felt a chill run down my spine as the words settled over us, and I realized they were right. Marcus, quiet, always in the back, was gone. He'd been with us at the basement door. I was sure of it. But now, there was no sign of him. It was like he'd simply vanished, just like the people who had once lived here. Panic crept in, quiet at first, then growing with each passing second. We retraced our steps, calling his name, our voices trembling as they echoed back to us from the empty rooms. The sound seemed to stretch, bending and twisting in the silence, as if the house was mocking us, giving back nothing but emptiness. Every room we searched felt wrong, like it had shifted in some subtle, impossible way. A chair facing the wrong direction, a book that wasn't there before, shadows that lingered too long before fading back into place. As we moved through the house, I couldn't help but feel like we were intruding, like the place was watching us, taking stock, deciding what to do with us. I started to notice small things, details I'd missed before. The thin layer of dust on every surface, undisturbed, but for our own footprints. There was no sign of Marcus, no hint that he'd ever been here. It was as if the house had erased him, removed every trace, leaving us alone with its silent, oppressive weight. And then the whispers started again. Faint, like a breeze moving through the walls, just at the edge of hearing. I could tell the others heard it too by the way they froze, their faces pale, eyes wide and searching. We couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, accusing, as if we'd broken some ancient rule just by stepping foot in this place. Each whisper felt like a needle, piercing through the silence, sinking deep into our minds. And the more we listened, the more it felt like they were coming from inside our own heads, like the house was speaking to each of us, telling us things it shouldn't know. One of us snapped, muttering something under their breath, hands pressed tightly over their ears. "It's in my head. It knows," he whispered, his voice shaky, almost desperate. I wanted to tell him it was just the silence, just nerves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. There was something in this place, something alive, something old and dark, and it had been waiting, watching, from the moment we'd stepped through that portal. We tried to leave then, heading for the front door, driven by an urgency that felt like a fever. But as we reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. The door was locked, somehow, even though there was no lock on it. We pulled, pushed, tried everything we could think of, but it was like the door had fused to the frame, like the house itself had decided we weren't leaving. That's when the light began to change. It was subtle at first, a dimming that felt almost natural, like the end of a long day. But as we looked around, we realized there was no source, no fading sunlight, just a creeping darkness filling the house from every corner, pushing in on us, swallowing the edges of our vision. Our flashlights flickered, their beams cutting through the dark in thin, desperate lines. But the darkness kept closing in, thick and heavy, like it had a mind of its own. In that darkness, I thought I saw movement. Shadows, shapes shifting in the corners of my eyes, too quick to focus on, slipping away as soon as I tried to look. But they were there, waiting, surrounding us, pressing closer with each second. I felt my heart hammering in my chest, my breath coming shallow and quick, as if the air itself had turned thick, suffocating. I knew somehow that we weren't alone, that whatever had taken Marcus was still here, watching us, waiting for its moment. We huddled together, flashlights shaking, voices reduced to whispers. No one wanted to admit it, but we all knew we were trapped in a place that didn't want us, a place that wasn't meant to be seen. I felt a chill run through me, a realization settling deep in my bones. This wasn't just another world. This place. It was something else entirely, something beyond human understanding, beyond the reach of science or reason. It was a place that remembered, that held on to things, and it wasn't going to let us leave. In that moment, as we stood there in the dark, surrounded by shadows and whispers, I felt something shift, a presence moving closer, brushing against my mind like a cold, dark wind. And for a brief, terrifying instant, I understood. This wasn't just another Earth. It was a place where humanity had come and gone, swallowed up by something older, something that had watched and waited and fed until there was nothing left. And now it had found us. The darkness thickened around us, swallowing up the light from our flashlights until they barely lit the space in front of us. Each beam wavered, barely cutting through the suffocating blackness that felt like it was pressing down on us, closing in from every angle. Our breaths grew shallow, each of us too afraid to speak, as if any sound would draw attention, wake whatever was lurking in those shadows. The whispers were louder now, no longer a faint murmur, but a soft, insistent drone, filling the room like an unseen current. And then, out of that oppressive silence, there came a new sound, a faint, shuffling noise, slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was moving towards us. The sound echoed, bouncing off the walls, distorting and twisting in the dark. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It felt like it was everywhere, circling us, closing in, pushing us back against the walls. I looked at the others, their faces pale and strained in the dim light, eyes wide with a shared, unspoken fear. None of us wanted to admit it, but we were all thinking the same thing. Whatever had taken Marcus was back. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the sounds, the whispers, the strange pulsing hum that seemed to vibrate through the floor, through my bones. It was a pattern, almost like a heartbeat, but deeper, more resonant. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing, waiting. And the closer that shuffling noise got, the more certain I became that this was no random encounter. We'd disturbed something here, something that had been lying dormant, hidden from time itself. And now it was awake. Someone muttered under their breath, words I couldn't make out, trembling and panicked. The darkness pressed in closer, and the sound grew louder, that slow, dragging shuffle, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. I felt my hands clench around the flashlight, knuckles white, trying to keep myself grounded, keep the fear from taking over completely. But the fear was relentless, creeping into every thought, every breath, every moment of silence between the sounds. And then, as quickly as it had started, the shuffling stopped. The silence fell again, more complete than before, as if even the air itself was holding its breath. We didn't move, didn't breathe, each of us frozen, waiting for whatever came next. I strained my ears, listening, waiting, but there was nothing. Just that oppressive silence, stretching on and on, until it felt like it would crush us under its weight. But then, slowly, I became aware of something else. A faint glow, barely noticeable at first, seeping through the darkness. It was coming from the far side of the room, soft and eerie, casting long, unnatural shadows that twisted and writhed across the walls. The light was pale, almost colorless, but it pulsed, a slow, rhythmic flicker that seemed to move in time with the strange hum beneath us. We all turned towards it, our breaths catching, our minds racing, as if drawn by something beyond our control. As we moved closer, the glow grew stronger, illuminating the edges of a doorway he hadn't noticed before. It was old, hidden in the corner of the room, barely more than an outline against the wall, but now it seemed to pulse with a strange, almost hypnotic light. I felt my hand reach out as if guided by some unseen force, fingertips grazing the edge of the door. It was cold, colder than anything I'd ever felt, a chill that seemed to seep into my skin, freezing me to the bone. I hesitated, looking back at the others, searching their faces for a sign, a word, anything to tell me not to open it. But they just stood there, silent, staring at the door with the same dread, the same morbid curiosity. We all knew we shouldn't open it. Everything about this place told us to turn back, to leave while we still could. But that pull, that strange, unexplainable draw was too strong to ignore, and so, slowly, I pushed the door open. The glow spilled out, washing over us in an eerie, unnatural light that seemed to twist and distort everything it touched. Beyond the door was a narrow corridor, lined with walls that seemed to stretch on forever, disappearing into the distance, bending and shifting in ways that defied logic. The air was colder here, thick with a smell that I couldn't quite place, metallic and stale, like something that had been buried for centuries. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to close the door and forget we'd ever seen it. But we were past the point of no return. We stepped into the corridor, the sound of our footsteps echoing down the endless hall. The glow seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, casting strange, elongated shadows that moved in ways shadows shouldn't. Every step felt heavier, as if the floor itself was dragging us down, sinking us deeper into the darkness. The whispers were louder here, no longer faint, but clear, words half-formed, voices overlapping, merging into a cacophony that made my head ache, as if they were trying to force their way into my mind. The corridor twisted, turning in on itself, leading us deeper into a place that felt more and more like a nightmare with each step. And as we walked, I began to notice things on the walls, markings, symbols carved deep into the stone, ancient and strange, their shapes twisting in ways that hurt to look at. They seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as the hum, alive in a way that was both fascinating and repulsive. We kept moving, each of us caught in that strange pull, unable to stop, unable to turn back. The whispers grew louder, clearer, their words forming in my mind, telling me things I didn't want to know, things I couldn't understand. They spoke of worlds beyond our own, places where humanity was nothing more than a fleeting memory, a ghost. They spoke of time, twisted and broken, of shadows that lived and breathed, of forces that watched and waited, ancient and patient. And then, at the end of the corridor, we saw it, a vast open space, stretching out into darkness, filled with shapes that seemed to shift and move just beyond the reach of the light. In the center of the room stood a figure, tall and still, shrouded in shadow, its form barely visible in the dim glow. It looked human, but only in the vaguest sense, its features blurred, shifting, as if it couldn't quite hold itself together. As we stood there, frozen, staring, it began to move, slowly, almost painfully, turning towards us. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me, deeper than anything I'd felt before, a dread that went beyond fear, beyond anything I could understand. It raised a hand, pointing directly at us, and in a voice that echoed through the darkness, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It spoke. "You don't belong here." That voice, it didn't just speak, it crawled into us, pressing into the parts of ourselves we kept hidden, where our deepest fears lay buried. It wasn't a command, nor a threat. It was a statement, absolute and final. "You don't belong here," the words echoed, reverberating through the dark space around us, twisting and bending in a way that felt wrong, unnatural. It was as if reality itself had bent to carry those words, warping around their meaning. No one dared to move. The figure stood there watching us with eyes that weren't eyes, dark hollows that seemed to go on forever. It was human, and yet it wasn't. Its form flickered, shifting and warping, as if it was made of shadows and smoke, barely held together by whatever strange force kept this place alive. I couldn't tear my gaze away, caught in that hollow stare, feeling the weight of something ancient and beyond comprehension pressing down on me. Slowly it lowered its hand, the movement smooth and deliberate, like it was considering us, deciding what to do with us. And then, almost as if it had made up its mind, it turned, drifting backward into the shadows, its form merging with the darkness until it was gone. But even after it disappeared, the feeling of its gaze lingered, pressing down on us like a weight, making it hard to breathe. One of us finally broke the silence, whispering, "What was that?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, because none of us knew. None of us had words for what we'd just seen, what we'd just felt. All I knew was that it was a warning. We were somewhere we shouldn't be, a place that was never meant to be found, and now it had noticed us. But as we turned to leave, something strange happened. The doorway we'd come through, it was gone. The corridor had shifted, twisted, closing us off from the way back. We were trapped. The walls, once narrow and confining, had grown wider, stretching out in impossible ways, like the entire structure was alive, adapting, keeping us within its reach. Panic set in, creeping through our group, silent but intense, each of us feeling the same horrible realization settle over us. There was no way back. We stumbled through the dark, flashlights flickering weakly as we searched for any sign of an exit. The walls were different now, lined with strange symbols that glowed faintly, casting an eerie light that seemed to move, breathing in and out with an unsettling rhythm. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, each one a thread of thought, pulling at the edges of our sanity, unraveling us piece by piece. They told us things we didn't want to hear, filling our minds with images and memories that weren't ours. Fragments of other lives, other worlds, twisted and broken, just like this place. We tried to keep moving, pushing forward, deeper into the labyrinth of hallways that seemed to shift and change with every step. Each corridor led to another, each turn revealing nothing but more darkness, more shadows, more of those strange, unsettling markings. It was as if the place itself was alive, watching us, guiding us deeper into its heart, pulling us further away from the world we knew. And in that endless dark, time began to lose meaning. Minutes felt like hours, hours like days, each second stretching on, bleeding into the next in an endless, suffocating spiral. One by one, we started to lose ourselves. I could see it in the faces of the others, the way their eyes darted around, wide and unblinking, skin pale and drawn, lips moving in silent whispers, as if they were hearing something only they could hear. They began to speak in broken sentences, talking about things that didn't make sense, things they couldn't have known. It was as if the place was rewriting us, piece by piece, replacing our memories, our thoughts, with something else, something dark and old and terrible. I tried to hold on to my thoughts, tried to remember who I was, where I came from, but it was slipping away, fading into the background, replaced by images of strange worlds, forgotten cities, places where humanity had come and gone, leaving nothing but shadows and echoes. It was like we were becoming part of this place, lost souls caught in the web of something beyond our comprehension. And then, just when I thought we'd been swallowed completely, we saw it. A light, faint but steady, cutting through the darkness like a beacon. It was a doorway, just ahead, glowing with a soft, warm light that felt impossibly out of place in this cold, dead world. Without thinking, we ran towards it, driven by a desperate hope that it was the way out, a way back to our world. But as we stepped through, I felt a strange pull, like a weight lifting from my mind, a sensation that was both freeing and terrifying. The doorway led us into a room vast and empty, with walls that stretched up into the darkness, disappearing into an endless void. And in the center of the room stood a large mirror, ancient and cracked, its surface dark and distorted, reflecting something that wasn't us. Our reflections stared back, but they were different, twisted, hollow versions of ourselves, eyes dark and empty, mouths twisted in silent screams. We stared, transfixed, unable to look away as our reflections began to move, shifting and twisting in ways that defied logic, bending and breaking as if the glass was alive, pulling them apart piece by piece. They seemed to watch us, pleading, their eyes wide with a horror that mirrored our own. And in that moment, I understood. The place wasn't just another world. It was a trap, a prison for souls, a place where reality had fractured, leaving nothing but shadows and echoes of lives that had been, of people who had crossed into the dark and never returned. The mirror began to glow, pulsing with that same eerie light, and I felt it again, that pull, that strange, irresistible force drawing us closer, urging us to step through. It was a way out, but at a cost. I could feel it in the air, a price waiting to be paid, a toll for trespassing into a world that wasn't ours. One by one, the others began to step forward, their faces blank, eyes empty, as if they were no longer themselves. I tried to hold back, tried to fight that pull, but it was too strong, too deep, like it was reaching into my soul, pulling me towards a mirror, towards that endless, hollow reflection. And as I took that final step, as I felt myself slipping into that dark, twisted world, I realized that this was it. We weren't going back. We were becoming part of it, lost in the shadows, just like the ones who'd come before us. And as the darkness closed in, as the last remnants of who we were faded into the void, I understood the true horror of it all. We hadn't just opened a portal to another Earth. We'd opened a door to something far older, far darker, a place where humanity had come and gone, leaving nothing but echoes and shadows, a world where the only remnants of life were the memories trapped within its endless walls. And now, we were part of it too, lost souls in a world that would never let us go. In that darkness, we were barely ourselves anymore. Everything that once felt solid, real, had dissolved, replaced by something hollow, something that felt like it had always been waiting for us here. I could still feel the others nearby, but they felt like echoes, distant and faded, just barely holding on to the memories of who they were. It was like we were blending into the place itself, becoming part of its twisted history, losing the last traces of our world, of our lives. But then, just as I felt myself slipping away completely, I became aware of a faint glimmer, a small, barely there light, shining through the dark. It felt different somehow, like a memory trying to break through, like a fragment of the world we'd come from. It flickered weak and distant, but it was enough to snap me back, to pull me out of that endless, consuming void, if only for a moment. I reached out, feeling a surge of something, hope, maybe, or desperation. I couldn't tell. It felt fragile, like something that would shatter if I looked too closely, but I held on to it, letting it pull me forward, guiding me through the darkness. The others were there, drawn to the light as well, their faces flickering in and out of view, half-formed and fading. We moved together, instinctively, pulled by that faint glimmer, as if it was the last remaining connection to the world we'd left behind. And then, as we stepped closer, the light grew stronger, revealing something that made my breath catch. It was a portal, a shimmering doorway hanging in the air, just like the one we'd come through. But it was different, somehow, darker, twisted like a distorted reflection of our world. And standing at its edge, just visible in the faint light, was a figure. It was Marcus. He looked at us, his face pale and drawn, eyes wide and hollow, like he'd been waiting there for a long, long time. His gaze was empty, blank, as if he was staring right through us. But there was something in his expression, a warning, maybe, or a plea. He raised a hand, pointing toward the portal, his movement slow and stiff, as if he was being pulled by something he couldn't see. I felt a shiver run down my spine, the realization sinking in. This wasn't just a way out, it was a trap, another layer of the twisted reality we'd stumbled into, a reflection that would pull us in and never let us go. I could feel it, the darkness waiting on the other side, stretching out, ready to take us in. And in that moment, I understood the terrible truth. There was no way back, no escape from this place. We were caught in its web, drawn in by forces beyond our control, beyond our understanding. One by one, the others began to step toward the portal, their faces blank, eyes empty, as if they were no longer themselves. I tried to call out, tried to pull them back, but it was too late. They stepped through, disappearing into the dark, their forms fading like shadows, swallowed up by the void. And as I watched them go, I felt a pull, a force drawing me closer, urging me forward, as if the place itself was calling to me. I took a step back, fighting against that pull, against the darkness that seemed to cling to me, dragging me down. But it was relentless, wrapping around me, filling my mind with whispers, with shadows, with fragments of lives I couldn't remember. And in that final moment, as I felt myself slipping away, I realized the full horror of what we'd done. We hadn't just opened a portal to another world, we'd opened a door to something far darker, something that had been waiting, watching, drawing us in. A place where humanity had come and gone, leaving nothing but echoes and shadows, a world that would hold on to us forever, trapping us in its endless hollow corridors, feeding on our memories, our souls, until there was nothing left. And as the darkness closed in, as the last remnants of who I was faded into the void, I knew that we were part of it now. Lost souls in a world that would never let us go. Echoes in the shadows, forgotten and alone, forever trapped in a place that was never meant to be seen.